already mentioned one possible weakness in Mill, and that's the fact that he probably doesn't pay attention enough to individual differences. What may be a higher pleasure for one person might not be pleasurable for another person at all. I'll give you a couple of examples from my own life, and then an example from an acquaintance of mine. All three of these examples illustrate the fact of individual differences pretty vividly. The first example is fairly trivial. Most people get stressed out by car accidents. I'm not saying I like to be in car accidents, although I've been in a couple of accidents where the cars were totaled and they were less stressful than I expected them to be. But what I specifically want to talk about is my relationship with YouTube videos of serious car accidents. Now, I don't like to see people die or anything. I'm not a monster. But there is this strange fact about me that if I'm stressed out, watching these car crash videos is mysteriously relaxing to me. Other people like warm milk or bedtime stories or marijuana. I like car crash videos. I get really peaceful when I'm watching them. My second example is also kind of trivial, but interesting, I think. Most people have a fear of heights. They get close to the edge of the Grand Canyon, feel vertigo, and back away. Now, I do feel vertigo in those situations, but it's a good feeling. I get intense pleasure from it. So I have a love of heights, where other people have a fear of heights. So it didn't take any courage for me to jump out of a plane a few years ago. It was a dream come true, getting to fly without a big piece of metal around me and without all that noise of jet engines. It was one of the most fun and even peaceful things I've done in my entire life. But most people are not going to say, yeah, cool, let's throw ourselves out of a plane at 13,000 feet. One more example from me. When I got interested in philosophy in college, people said, well, whatever you do, don't try to study Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. It's the most difficult book to read on the planet. And so I said, well, that's my book. I looked into it around my sophomore year. I was 18. Sure enough, I thought, I have no idea what this guy is talking about. I could spend the rest of my life studying this book, and I still wouldn't completely understand what Kant is up to here. And that's what I was looking for, the biggest challenge I could find. I had to learn German so I could read the book in the original. And of course, I've read a lot of other books since then. But I've come back to that book over and over again over the past almost 40 years, because I take intense pleasure in how challenging that book is for me. It has made me think more deeply and with greater precision than any other book I've had in my hands. Studying that book is my version of mountain climbing. And yes, it's more fun to me than skydiving, or else I would have joined some other branch of the military I would have joined some branch of the military instead of getting a PhD in philosophy. But I know most people read that book and say, leave me the heck alone with this stuff. It's not pleasurable at all for most people. My sister and I once had a funny conversation where she asked me what philosophy is. I gave her a little overview of the kind of things we talk about. She rolled her eyes and said, you could spend the rest of your life on stuff like that. I laughed and said, yeah, I could spend the rest of my life on stuff like that. People like different things. One more example. Many years ago, I hosted a radio show on KXLU where I interviewed interesting people who were committed to some project or other to help other people. And one of the people I interviewed was this AIDS researcher who was working on possible genetic therapies for AIDS. And of course, most of us would assume that he was motivated by wanting to help people who are suffering from the disease. And I think I assumed that when I invited him into the studio for an interview. But that wasn't his motivation at all, as it turned out. What he talked about was how beautiful an organism HIV is. He was so excited about how much ability the virus has to mutate and survive. In other words, he was a pure biologist, someone who is interested in nature for its own sake and how it works in the greatest possible detail. There were other people in his research group who who were working on the medications and other therapies. He was doing the basic science of figuring out how the virus works, how it's structured, what it does to survive. Now, I want to be really careful. I don't want you to draw the wrong conclusion from this story. I'm absolutely not condemning this man. Thank God there are people who are motivated to do the basic science, because we can't cure AIDS without understanding it first. And yes, nature is a beautiful thing in all its forms. And what motivated him to do this work was admiring the beauty of nature. But he really didn't think much about the human beings who were suffering from the disease. He made a great research scientist. If I had HIV, I would not want him as a doctor, because treating patients is not his thing. My point here is about individual differences. Each of us has different lower pleasures and different higher pleasures, whereas Mill seems to imply that we will all end up having the same higher pleasures. At least he's not careful to point to individual differences and what impact this might have on his theory. So let's note that as one possible weakness or limitation of Mill's theory. But the next video is about the most important and most serious weakness of the GHP, which I believe is right there in the GHP itself.